readers, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I've got the final 2 chapters of Emily of New Moon to share with you guys. We're going to be reading chapters 30 and 31. If you're new to this series, I've got an entire playlist with, now at this point, the entire book. You can start from the beginning and listen all the way through, or else you can just pop in and listen to these 2 right now. In a couple of days, I'm going to have a poll on the community tab where you can vote on the next book that we're going to read. So that'll be fun. This reading to you guys just sort of started as a quarantine / lockdown project. I thought maybe if some of you were feeling anxious or sad, or you just needed something to distract your mind, that maybe you could find that here. So anyway, let's get on into the final 2 chapters. Chapter 30 is called When the Curtain Lifted. It would be pleasant to be able to record that after the reconciliation in the Lookout, Emily and Aunt Elizabeth lived in entire amity and harmony. But the truth was that things went on pretty much the same as before. Emily went softly and tired to mingle Serpent's wisdom and Dove's harmlessness in practical proportions. But their points of view were so different that there were bound to be clashes. They did not speak the same language, so there was bound to be misunderstanding. And yet there was a difference, a very vital difference. Elizabeth Murray had learned an important lesson, that there was not one law of fairness for children and another for grown-ups. She continued to be as autocratic as ever, but she did not do or say to Emily anything she would not have said to Laura had occasion called for it. Emily, on her side, had discovered the fact that, under all her surface coldness and sternness, Aunt Elizabeth really had an affection for her, and it was wonderful what a difference this made. It took the sting out of Aunt Elizabeth's ways and words, and healed entirely a certain little half-conscious sore spot that had been in Emily's heart ever since the incident of the drawn slips at Maywood. I don't believe I'm a duty to Aunt Elizabeth anymore, she thought. Emily grew rapidly that summer in body, mind, and soul. Life was delightful, growing richer every hour like an unfolded rose. Forms of beauty filled her imagination and were transferred, as best she could, to paper, although they were never so lovely there, and Emily had a heartbreaking moment of true artist who discovers that never on painter's canvas lives the charm of his fancy's dream. Much of her old stuff she burned. Even Child of the Sea was reduced to ashes, but the little pile of manuscripts in the mantel cupboard of the Lookout was growing steadily larger. Emily kept her scribblings there now. The sofa shelf in the garret was desecrated, and besides, she felt somehow that Aunt Elizabeth would never meddle with her private papers again, no matter where they were kept. She did not go now to the garret to read or write or dream. Her own dear Lookout was the best place for that. She loved that quaint little room intensely. It was almost like a living thing to her, a sharer in gladness, a comforter in sorrow. Ilse was growing too, blossoming out into strange beauty and brilliance, knowing no law but her own pleasure, recognizing no authority but her own whim. Aunt Laura worried over her. She'll be a woman so soon, and who will look after her? Alan won't. I've no patience with Alan, said Aunt Elizabeth grimly. He's always ready to hector and advise other people. He'd better look at home. He'll come over here and order me to do this or that, or not do it for Emily, but if I say one word to him about Ilsa, he blows the roof off. The idea of a man turning against his daughter and neglecting her as he has neglected Ilsa simply because her mother wasn't all she sought out to be. As if the poor child was to blame for that. Shh, said Aunt Laura as Emily crossed the sitting room on her way upstairs. Emily smiled sadly to herself. Aunt Laura needn't be shushing. There was nothing left for her to find out about Ilsa's mother, nothing except the most important thing of all, which neither she nor anybody else living knew, for Emily had never surrendered her conviction that the whole truth about Beatrice Burnley was not known. She often worried about it when she lay curled up on the black walnut bed at nights, listening to the moan of the Gulf and the wind woman singing in the trees, and drifted into sleep, wishing intensely that she could solve the dark old mystery and dissolve its legend of shame and bitterness. Emily went rather languidly upstairs to the Lookout. She meant to write some more of the story, The Ghost of the Well, wherein she was weaving the old legend of the well in the Lee field, but somehow interest was lacking. She put the manuscript back onto the mantel cupboard. She read over a letter from Dean Priest which had come that day, one of his big, jolly, whimsical, delightful letters wherein he had told her that he was coming to stay a month with his sister at Blair Water. She wondered why this announcement did not excite her more. She was tired. Her head was aching. Emily couldn't remember ever having had a headache before. Since she could not write, she decided to lie down and be Lady Trevanion for a while. Emily was Lady Trevanion very often that summer, in one of the dream lives she had begun to build up for herself. Lady Trevanion was the wife of an English earl, and besides being a famous novelist, was a member of the British House of Commons, where she always appeared in black velvet with a stately coronet of pearls on her dark hair. She was the only woman in the house, and, as this was before the days of the suffragettes, she had to endure many sneers and innuendos and insults from the ungallant males around her. Emily's favorite dream scene was where she rose to make her first speech, a wonderfully thrilling event. As Emily found it difficult to do justice to the whole scene in any of her own, she fell back on Pitt's reply to Walpole, which she had found in her royal reader, and declaimed it with suitable variations. The insolent speaker who had provoked Lady Trevanion into speech had sneered at her as a woman, and Lady Trevanion, a magnificent creature in her velvet and pearls, rose to her feet amid hushed and dramatic silence and said, "The atrocious crime of being a woman, which the honorable member has, with such spirit and decency, charged upon me, I shall attempt neither to palliate nor deny, but shall content myself with wishing that I may be one of those whose follies cease with their sex, and not one of that number who are ignorant in spite of manhood and experience." Here she was always interrupted by thunders of applause. But the savor was entirely lacking in this scene today, and by the time Emily had reached that line, "But womanhood, sir, is not my only crime," she gave up in disgust and fell to worrying over Ilse's mother again, mixed up with some uneasy speculations regarding the climax of her story about the ghost of the well, mingled with her unpleasant physical sensations. Her eyes hurt when she moved them. She was chilly, although the July day was hot. She was lying there when Aunt Elizabeth came up to ask why she hadn't gone to bring the cows home from the pasture. I didn't know it was so late," said Emily. My head aches, Aunt Elizabeth." Aunt Elizabeth rolled up the white cotton blind and looked at Emily. She noted her flushed face. She felt her pulse. Then she bade her shortly to stay where she was, went down, and sent Perry for Dr. Burnley. "Probably she's got the measles," said the doctor. "There's an outbreak of them at Dairy Pond. Has she had any chance to catch them?" "Jimmy Jobell's 2 children were here one afternoon about 10 days ago. She played with them. She's always playing around with people she's no business to associate. I haven't heard that they were or have been sick, though." Jimmy Jobell, when plainly asked, confessed that his young ones had come out with the measles the very day after they had been at New Moon. There was therefore not much doubt as to Emily's sickness. "It's a bad kind of measles, apparently," the doctor said. "Quite a number of the Dairy Pond children have died of it. Mostly French, though. The kids would be out of bed when they had no business to be and caught cold. I don't think you need to worry about Emily. She might as well have measles and be done with it. Keep her warm. Keep the room dark. I'll run over in the morning." For 3 or 4 days, nobody was much alarmed. Measles was a disease everybody had to have at some point. Aunt Elizabeth looked at Emily well and often, and slipped on the sofa, which had been moved into the lookout. She even left the window open at night, and in spite of this, perhaps Aunt Elizabeth thought because of it, Emily grew steadily sicker. And on the 5th day, a sharp change for the worse took place. Her fever went up rapidly. Delirium set in. Dr. Burnley came, looking anxious, scowled, changed the medicine. "I'm sent for a bad case of pneumonia at White Cross," he said, "and I have to go to Charlottetown in the morning to be present at Mrs. Jackwell's operation. I promised her I would go. I'll be back in the evening. Emily's very restless. That high-strung system of hers is evidently very sensitive to fever. What's that nonsense she's talking about, the Wind Woman?" "Oh, I don't know," said Aunt Elizabeth worriedly. "She's always talking nonsense, even when she's well. Alan, tell me plainly, is there any danger?" "There's always danger in this type of measles. I don't like these symptoms. The eruption should be out by now, but there's no sign of it. Her fever's very high, but I don't think we need to be alarmed yet. If I thought otherwise, I wouldn't go to town and leave her. Keep her quiet as possible. Humor her whims if you can. I don't like that mental disturbance. She looks really terribly distressed, and she seems to be worrying about something. Has she had anything on her mind of late? Oh, not that I know of, said Aunt Elizabeth. She had a sudden bitter realization that she really didn't know much about the child's mind. Emily would never have come to her with any of her little troubles and worries. Emily, what's bothering you? Asked Dr. Burnley softly, very softly. He took the hot, tossing little hand gently, oh so gently, in his big one. Emily looked up with wild, fever-bright eyes. She couldn't have done it. She couldn't have done it. Of course she couldn't, said the doctor cheerily. Don't worry, she didn't. His eyes telegraphed, what does she mean? To Elizabeth, but Elizabeth shook her head. Who are you talking about, dear? She asked Emily. But Emily was off on another track. The well to Mr. Lee's field was open, she declared. Someone would be sure to fall into it. Why didn't Mr. Lee shut it up? Dr. Burnley left Aunt Elizabeth trying to reassure Emily on the point and hurried away to White Cross. At the door he nearly fell over Perry, who was curled up on the sandstone slab, hugging his sunburned legs desperately. How is Emily? He demanded. Don't bother me, I'm in a hurry, growled the doctor. You tell me how Emily is, or I'll hang on to your coat until the seams go, said Perry. I can't get one word of sense out of them old maids. You tell me. She's a sick child, but I'm not seriously alarmed about her yet. The doctor gave his coat another tug, but Perry held on for a last word. You've got to cure her, he said. If anything happens to Emily, I'll drown myself in the pond. He let go suddenly, so suddenly that Dr. Burnley nearly went headlong onto the ground. Then Perry curled up on the doorstep again. He watched there until Laura and Cousin Jimmy had gone to bed, and then he sneaked through the house and sat on the stairs, where he could hear any sound in Emily's room. He sat there all night, his fists clenched, as if keeping guard against an unseen foe. Elizabeth Murray watched by Emily until 2 o'clock, and then Laura took her place. She has raved a great deal, said Aunt Elizabeth. I wish I knew what's worrying her. There is something, I feel sure. It isn't all mere delirium. She keeps repeating she couldn't have done it in such imploring tones. I wonder, Lord, you remember the time I read her letters? Do you think she means me? Laura shook her head. She had never seen Elizabeth so moved. If the child doesn't get better, said Aunt Elizabeth. Laura sat down by the bed. She was pale and drawn with her own worry and fatigue, for she had not been able to sleep. She loved Emily as her own child, and the awful dread that had possessed her heart would not lift for an instant. I see her coming over the fields, she said in a high, clear voice. She's coming so gladly, she's singing, she's thinking of her baby. Oh, keep her back, she doesn't see the well. It's so dark. She doesn't see it, oh, she's gone into it. In the silence, Emily's voice rose in a piercing shriek which penetrated to Aunt Elizabeth's room and brought her flying across the hall in her flannel nightgown. What is wrong, Laura? She gasped. Laura was trying to soothe Emily, who was struggling to sit up in bed. Her cheeks were crimson and her eyes had still the same far wild look. Emily, darling, you've just had a bad dream. The old Lee well isn't open. Nobody has fallen into it. Yes, somebody has, said Emily. She has. I saw her. With the ace of hearts on her forehead. Do you think I don't know? She fell back on her pillow, moaned, tossed the hands which Laura Murray had loosened in her surprise. The two ladies of New Moon looked at each other across her bed in dismay and something like terror. Who did you see, Emily? Asked Aunt Elizabeth. Ilse's mother, of course. I always knew she didn't go that dreadful thing. She fell into the old well. She's there now. Go and get her out. Aunt Laura, please. Yes, of course we'll get her out, darling, said Aunt Laura. Emily sat up in bed and looked at Aunt Laura again. This time she did not look through her. She looked into her. Laura Murray felt those burning eyes read her soul. You're lying to me, cried Emily. You don't mean to try to get her out. You're only saying it to put me off. Aunt Elizabeth, she suddenly turned. You'll do it, won't you? You'll go and get her out of the old well, won't you? Elizabeth remembered that Dr. Burnley had said that Emily's whims must be humored. She was terrified by the child's condition. Yes, I'll go get her out if she's in there, she said. Emily released her hand and sank down. I know you'll keep your word, she said. You're very hard, but you never lie, Aunt Elizabeth. Elizabeth Murray went back to her own room and dressed herself with her shaking fingers. A little later, when Emily had fallen into a quiet sleep, Laura went down the stairs and heard Elizabeth giving Cousin Jimmy some orders in the kitchen. "Elizabeth, you don't really mean to have that old well searched?" "I do," said Elizabeth resolutely. "I know it's nonsense as well as you do, but I had to promise it to quiet her down, and I will keep my promise. You heard what she said. She believed I wouldn't lie to her, so I can't. Jimmy, you'll go over to the James Lees after breakfast and ask him to come here." "How has she heard the story?" said Laura. "I don't know. Oh, someone's told her, of course. Perhaps that old demon Nancy Priest. It doesn't matter who. She's heard it, and the thing is to keep her quiet. It isn't so much of a job to put ladders in the well and get someone to go down it. The thing that matters is the absurdity of it." "We'll be laughed at," protested Laura, whose share of Murray pride was in hot revolt. "And besides, it will open up all the old scandal again." "I don't care," said Elizabeth. "I'm keeping my word to the child." Alan Burnley came to New Moon at sunset. He was on his way home from town. He was tired, for he had been going day and night for over a week. He was more worried than he admitted over Emily. He looked old and rather desolate as he stepped into the New Moon kitchen. Only Cousin Jimmy was there. Cousin Jimmy did not seem to have much to do, although it was a good day, and Jimmy, Joe Bell, and Perry were hauling the great fragment sun-dried loads. He sat by the western window with a strange expression on his face. "Hello, Jimmy. Where are the girls, and how is Emily?" "Emily's better. The rash is out, and her fever has gone down. I think she's sleeping." "Good. We couldn't afford to lose that little girl, could we, Jimmy?" "No," said Jimmy, but he did not seem to want to talk about it. "Laura and Elizabeth were in the sitting room. They went to see you. There is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed." It occurred to Alan Burnley that Jimmy was acting mysteriously, and if Laura and Elizabeth wanted to see him, why didn't they just come out? It wasn't like them to stand on ceremony and in this passion. He pushed open the sitting room door immediately, impatiently. Laura Murray was sitting on the sofa, leaning her head on its arm. He could not see her face, but felt that she was crying. Elizabeth was sitting bolt upright on a chair. She wore her second-best black silk and her second-best lace cap, and she, too, had been crying. Dr. Burnley never attached much importance to Laura's tears, easy as those of most women. But Elizabeth Murray crying? Had he ever seen her cry before? He thought of it. The thought of Ilsa flashed into his mind. Has his little neglected daughter had anything happened to Ilsa? "What's wrong?" he exclaimed. "Oh, Alan," said Elizabeth Murray, "God forgive us. God forgive us all. Is it Ilsa?" No, not Ilsa." And then she told him. She told him what had been found at the bottom of the old Lee well. She told him what had been the real fate of the lovely, laughing young wife, whose name for 12 bitter years had never crossed his lips. It was not until the next evening that Emily saw the doctor. She was lying in bed, weak and limp, red as a beet, with the measles rash, but quite herself again. Alan Burnley stood by the bed and looked down at her. "Emily, do you know what you've done for me?" "God knows how you did it." "I thought you didn't believe in God," said Emily. "You've given me back some faith in him, Emily." "Why, what have I done?" Dr. Burnley saw that she had no remembrance of her delirium. Laura had told him that she had slept long and soundly after Elizabeth's promise, and had awakened with fever gone and the eruption fast coming out. She had asked nothing, and they had said nothing. "When you're better, we will tell you," he said. There was something very sorrowful about the smile that he smiled at her, and yet something very sweet. "He's smiling with his eyes as well as his mouth now," thought Emily. "How did she know?" whispered Laura to him when he went down. "I can't understand it, Alan." "Nor I. These things are beyond us, Laura. I only know this child has given Beatrice back to me, stainless and beloved. It can be explained rationally enough, perhaps. Emily has evidently been told about Beatrice and worried over it. Her repeated, 'she couldn't have done it,' shows that, and the tales of the old Lee well naturally made a deep impression on the mind of a sensitive child, keenly alive to dramatic values. In her delirium, she mixed this all up with the well-known fact of Jimmy's tumble into the New Moon well, and the rest was coincidence. I would have explained it all myself once, but now, Laura, I only say humbly, a little child shall lead them. Our stepmother's mother was a Highland Scotchwoman. They said she had the second sight," said Elizabeth. "I never believed in it before." The excitement of Blairwater had died away before Emily was deemed strong enough to hear the story. That which had been found in the old Lee well had been buried in the Mitchell plot in Shrewsbury, and a white marble shaft sacred to the memory of Beatrice Burnley, beloved wife of Alan Burnley, had been erected. The sensation caused by Dr. Burnley's presence every Sunday in the old Burnley pew had died away. On the first evening that Emily was allowed to sit up, Aunt Laura told her the whole story. Her manner of telling stripped it forever of the taint and innuendo left by Aunt Nancy. "I knew Elsa's mother couldn't have done it," said Emily triumphantly. "We blame ourselves now for our lack of faith," said Aunt Laura. "We should have known too, but it did seem black against her at the time. Emily, she was a bright, beautiful, merry creature. We thought her close friendship with her cousin natural and harmless. We now know it was, but all those years since her disappearance, we believed differently. Mr. James Lee remembers clearly that the well was open the night of Beatrice's disappearance. His hired man had taken the old rotten planks off it that evening, intending to put the new ones on at once. And then Robert Grierson's house caught fire and he ran with everybody else to save it. By the time it was out, it was too dark to finish with the well, and the man said nothing about it until morning. Mr. Lee was angry with him. He said it was a scandalous thing to leave a well uncovered like that. He went right down and put the new planks in place himself. But he didn't look down the well. And he looked, he would have seen nothing, for the ferns grow out from the sides, screened the depths. It was just after harvest. No one was in the field again before the next spring. He never connected Beatrice's disappearance with the open well. He wonders now that he didn't. But you see, dear, there had been such malicious gossip, and Beatrice was known to have gone on board the Lady of Winds. For 12 years we've wronged the dead, but Emily, how could you know? I don't know. When the doctor came in that day, I couldn't remember anything, but now it seems to me that I remember something. Just as if I dreamed it, of seeing Ilse's mother coming over the fields. It was dark, and yet I could see the Ace of Hearts. I don't know. I don't like to think of it some way. "We won't talk of it again," said Aunt Laura gently. "It's one of those things best not talked of." "And Elsa, does her father love her now?" asked Emily eagerly. "Yes, he can't get enough. He can't love her enough. It seems as if he were pouring out on her at once all the shut-up love of those 12 years. He'll likely spoil her now as much with indulgence as he did before with neglect." "It will take a lot of love to spoil Elsa," laughed Laura. "She's drinking it up like a thirsty sponge, and she loves him wildly in return. There isn't a trace of grudge in her over this long neglect." "All the same," said Elizabeth grimly, tucking pillows behind Emily's back with a very gentle hand, oddly in contrast with her severe expression, "he won't get off so easily. Ilse has run wild for 12 years. He won't find it so easy to make her behave properly now, if he ever does." "Love will do wonders," said Aunt Laura softly. "Of course, Ilse's dying to come and see you, Emily, but she must wait until there's no danger of infection. I told her she might write, but when she found I would have to read it because of your eyes, she said she'd wait until you could read it yourself." "Evidently," Laura laughed again, "evidently Ilse has much of importance to tell you." "I didn't know anybody could be as happy as I am now," said Emily. "And oh, Aunt Elizabeth, it is so nice to feel hungry again and to have something to chew." Chapter 31, Emily's Great Moment. Emily's convalescence was rather slow. Physically, she recovered with normal celerity, but a certain spiritual and emotional languor persisted for a time. One cannot go down to the depths of hidden things and escape the penalty. Aunt Elizabeth said she moped, but Emily was too happy and contented to mope. It was just that life seemed to have lost its savor for a time, as if some spring of vital energy had been drained out of it and refilled slowly. She had just then no one to play with. Perry, Ilse, and Teddy had all come down with measles the same day. Mrs. Kent at first declared bitterly that Teddy had caught them at New Moon, but all three had contracted them at Sunday school, where the Dairy Pond children had been. That picnic infected all Blairwater. There was a perfect orgy of measles. Teddy and Ilse were only moderately ill, but Perry, who had insisted on going home to Aunt Tom at the first symptoms, nearly died. Emily was not allowed to know his danger until it had passed, lest to worry her too much. Even Aunt Elizabeth worried over it. She was surprised to discover just how much they missed Perry around the house. It was fortunate for Emily that Dean Priest was in Blairwater during this forlorn time. His companionship was just what she needed and helped her wonderfully on the road to complete recovery. They went for long walks together all over Blairwater, with Tweed woofing around them, and explored places and roads Emily had never seen before. They watched a young moon grow old night by night. They talked in dim-scented chambers of twilight, over long red roads of mystery. They followed the lure of the hill winds, and they saw the stars rise, and Dean told her all about them, the great constellations of the old myths. It was a wonderful month, but on the first day of Teddy's convalescence, Emily was off to Tansy Patch for the afternoon, and Jarback Priest walked, if he walked at all, alone. Aunt Elizabeth was extremely polite to him, although she did not like the priests of Priest Pond much, and never quite felt comfortable under the mocking gleam of Jarback's green eyes and the faint derision of his smile, which seemed to make Murray pride and Murray traditions seem much less important than they really were. He has the priest flavor, she told Laura, though it isn't as strong in him as most of them. And he's certainly helping Emily. She has begun to spunk up since he came. Emily continued to spunk up, and by September, when the measles epidemic was spent and Dean Priest had gone on one of his sudden swoops over to Europe for the autumn, she was ready for school again, a little taller, a little thinner, a little less childlike, with a great gray shadowy eyes that looked into death and read the riddle of a buried thing, and henceforth would hold them in some haunting, elusive remembrance of the world behind the veil. Dean Priest had seen it. Mr. Carpenter saw it, when she smiled at him across her desk at school. "She's left the childhood of her soul behind, though she's still a child in body," he muttered. One afternoon, amidst the golden days and hazes of October, he asked her gruffly to let him see some of her verses. "I never meant to encourage you in it," he said. "I don't mean it now. Probably you can write a line of real poetry and never will. Or probably you can't write a line of real poetry and never will, but let me see your stuff. If it's hopelessly bad, I'll tell you. I won't have you wasting years striving for the unattainable. At least I won't have it on my conscience if you do. If there's any promise in it, I'll tell you just so, as honestly. And bring some of your stories too. They're trash yet, that's certain, but I'll see if they show just and sufficient cause for carrying on." Emily spent a very solemn hour that evening, weighing, choosing, rejecting. To the little bundle of verse she added one of her Jimmy books, which contained, as she thought, her best stories. She went to school next day, so secret and mysterious that Ilse took offense, started in to call her names, and then stopped. Ilse had promised her father that she would try to break herself of the habit of calling names. She was making fairly good on it, and then she was making fairly good headway, and then her conversation, if less vivid, was beginning to approximate to New Moon standards. Emily made a sad mess of her lessons that day. She was nervous and frightened. She had a tremendous respect for Mr. Carpenter's opinion. Father Cassidy had told her to keep on. Dean Priest had told her that someday she might really write. But perhaps they were only trying to be encouraging because they liked her and didn't want to hurt her feelings. Emily knew Mr. Carpenter would not do this. No matter if he did like her, he would nip her aspirations mercilessly if he thought the root of the matter was not in her. If, on the contrary, he bade her Godspeed, she would rest content with that against the world, and never lose heart in the face of any future criticisms. No wonder the day seemed fraught with tremendous issues to Emily. When school was out, Mr. Carpenter asked her to remain. She was so white and tense that the other pupils thought she must have been found out by Mr. Carpenter in some especially dreadful behavior, and knew she was going to catch it. Rhoda Stewart flung her a significantly malicious smile from the porch, which Emily never even saw. She was indeed at a momentous bar with Mr. Carpenter as supreme judge, and her whole future career, so she believed, hanging on his verdict. The pupils disappeared, and a mellow, sunshiny stillness settled over the old schoolroom. Mr. Carpenter took the little packet she had given him in the morning out of his desk, come down the aisle, and sat in the seat before her, facing her. Very deliberately he settled his glasses astride his hooked nose, took out a manuscript and began to read, or rather to glance over them, flinging scraps of comments mingled with grunts, sniffs and hoots at her as he glanced. Emily folded her cold hands on her desk and braced her feet against the legs of it to keep her knees from trembling. Said Mr. Carpenter. "Sunset. Lord, how many poems have been written on sunset? The clouds are massed in splendid state at heaven's unbarred western gate, where troops of star-eyed spirits wait." What does that mean? I don't know, Emily said. Her wits had been scattered by the sudden swoop of his spiked glance. Mr. Carpenter snorted. For heaven's sake, girl, don't write what you can't understand yourself. And this, to life? Life is thy gift, I ask no rainbow joy. Is that sincere? Is it? Stop and think. Do you ask no rainbow joy of life? He transfixed her with another glare, but Emily was beginning to pick herself up a bit. Nevertheless, she suddenly felt oddly ashamed of the very elevated and unselfish desires expressed in that moment. No, I do want rainbow joy, lots of it. Of course you do, we all do. We don't get it, you won't get it, but don't be a hypocrite and pretend you don't want it. Even in a sonnet, listen to lines to a mountain cascade. On its dark rocks, like the whiteness of a veil around a bride. Where'd you see a mountain cascade in Prince Edward Island? Nowhere. But there's a picture of one in Dr. Burnley's library. A wood stream, the threading sunbeams quiver, the bending bushes shiver, o'er thy little shadowy river. There's only one more rhyme that occurs to me, and that's liver. Why did you leave it out? Emily writhed. Wind song. I have shaken the dew in the meadows from the clover's creamy gown. Pretty but weak. June. June, for heaven's sake, girl. Don't write poetry on June. It's the sickliest subject in the world. It's been written to death. No, June is immortal, cried Emily suddenly, a sparkle replacing the strained look in her eyes. She was not going to let Mr. Carpenter have it all his own way. But Mr. Carpenter had tossed June aside without even reading it. I weary of the hungry world. What do you know, the hungry world, you and your new moon seclusion of old trees and old maids, but it is hungry. Ode to winter, the seasons are a sort of disease all young poets must have, it seems. Ha! Spring will not forget. That's a good line, the only good line to it. Wanderings. I've learned the secret of the ruin, that the somber pines on the hillside crewin. Have you learned that secret, Emily? I think I've always known it, said Emily dreamily. The flash of unimaginable sweetness that sometimes surprised her had just come and gone. Aim and endeavor. Too didactic. You've no right to try to teach until you're old, and then you won't want to. Her face was like a star, all pale and fair. Were you looking in the glass when you composed that line? No, she said. When the morning light is shaken like a banner on the hill. A good line, a good line. Oh, on such a golden morning to be living is delight. Too much like a faint echo of Wordsworth. The sea in September, blue and astutely bright. Child, how can you marry Child, how can you marry the right adjectives like that? Morning, all the secret fears that haunt the night. What do you know of the fears that haunt the night? Well, I know something, said Emily, remembering her first night at Wither Grange, to a dead day, with a chilly calm on her brow that only the dead may wear. Have you ever seen the chilly calm on the brow of the dead, Emily? Yes, said Emily. I thought so, otherwise you couldn't have written that. And even as it is, how old are you? 13 last May. Huh. Lines to Mrs. George Irving's infant son. You should study the art of titles, Emily. There's a fashion in them, as in everything else. Your titles are as out of date as the candles of new moon. Soundly he sleeps with his red lips pressed like a beautiful blossom close to her breast. The rest isn't worth reading. September. Is there a month you've missed? Windy meadows, harvest deep. Good line. Blairwater by moonlight. Gossamer. Emily, nothing but gossamer. The garden of new moon. Beguiling laughter and old song of merry maids and men. Good line, I suppose new moon is full of ghosts. Death's fell minion well fulfilled its part. That might have passed in Addison's day, but not now, Emily. Your azure dimples are the graves where million buried sunbeams play. Atrocious, Emily, atrocious. Graves aren't playgrounds. How much would you play if you were buried? Emily writhed and blushed again. Why couldn't she have seen that herself? Any goose could have seen it. Sail onward, ships, white wings sail on, till past the horizon's purple bar, drift from sight in flush of dawn. Sail on, neath the evening star. Trash! Yet there's a picture in it. Lap softly, purple waves, I dream, and dreams are sweet. I'll wake no more. Ah, but you'll have to wake if you want to accomplish anything. You've used purple twice in the same poem, Emily. Buttercups in a golden frenzy. A golden frenzy, Emily. I saw the wind shaking the buttercups. From the purple gates of the west I come. You're too fond of purple, Emily. But it's such a lovely word, she said. Dreams that seem too bright to die, seem but never are, Emily. The luring voice of the echo fame. So you heard it too. It is a lure, and for most of us it is only an echo, and that's the last of the lot. Mr. Carpenter swept the little sheets aside, folded his arms on the desk, and looked over his glasses at Emily. Emily looked back at him mutely, nervelessly. All the life seemed to have been drained out of her body and concentrated in her eyes. 10 good lines out of 400, Emily. Comparatively good, that is. And all the rest, balderdash. I suppose so, said Emily faintly. Her eyes brimmed with tears. What are you crying for? Demanded Mr. Carpenter. I'm sorry you think it's no good, she said. Mr. Carpenter gave the desk a mighty thump. No good? Didn't I tell you there were 10 good lines? For 10 righteous men, Sodom has been spared. Do you mean that after that? The candle was being relighted again. Of course. I mean, if at 13 you can write 10 good lines. Emily, at 20 you'll write 10 times 10. If the gods are kind, stop messing over months, though. And don't imagine you're a genius, either. If you have written 10 decent lines, I think there's something trying to speak through you, but you'll have to make yourself a fit instrument for it. You've got to work hard and sacrifice. By God, you've chosen a jealous goddess, and she never lets her go. Not even when she shuts her ears forever to their plea. What have you got there? Emily, her heart thrilling, handed him her Jimmy book. She was so happy that it shone through her whole being. She saw her future, wonderful, brilliant. Oh, her goddess would listen to her. Emily B. Starr, the distinguished poet. E. Bird Starr, the rising young novelist. She was recalled from her enchanting reverie by a chuckle from Mr. Carpenter. She wondered a little uneasily what he was laughing at. She didn't think there was anything funny in that book. It contained only 3 or 4 of her latest stories. The Butterfly Queen, A Little Fairy Tale, The Disappointed House, wherein she had woven a pretty dream of hopes came true after long years. The Secret of Glen, which in spite of its title was a fanciful little dialogue between the spirit of the snow, the spirit of the gray rain, the spirit of mist, and the spirit of moonshine. So you think I'm not beautiful when I say my prayers, said Mr. Carpenter. Emily gasped, realized what had happened, made a frantic grab at her Jimmy book, missed it. Mr. Carpenter held it beyond her reach and mocked her. She'd given him the wrong Jimmy book, and this one, oh horrors, what was in it? Or rather, what wasn't in it? Sketches of everyone in Blairwater and a very full description of Mr. Carpenter himself. Intent on describing him exactly, she had been mercilessly lucid, as she always was, especially in regard to the odd faces he made on mornings. I'm so sorry, said Emily, crimson with shame all over her dainty paleness. Why, I wouldn't have missed this for all the poetry you've written. It's literature, and you're only 13, but you don't know what's ahead of you. The stony hills, the steep ascents, the buffets, the discouragements. Stay in the valley if you're wise, Emily. Why do you want to write? Give me a reason. I want to be famous and rich. Everybody does. Is that all? No, I just love to write. A better reason, but still not enough. Tell me this, if you knew you'd be poor as a church mouse all your life, if you knew you'd never have a line published, would you keep writing? Of course I would. Why, I have to write. I can't help it. Oh, then I'd waste my breath giving advice at all. If it's in you to climb, you must. There are those who must lift their eyes to the hills. They can't breathe properly in the valleys. God help them if there's some weakness in them that prevents their climbing. You don't understand a word what I'm saying yet, but go on, climb. There, take your book and go home. 30 years from now, I will have a claim to distinction in the fact that Emily Bird Starr was once a pupil of mine. Go. Go before I remember what a disrespectful baggage you are to write such stuff about me and be properly enraged. Emily went, still a bit scared, but oddly exultant behind her fright. She was so happy that her happiness seemed to irradiate the world with its own splendor. All the sweet sounds of nature around her seemed like broken words of her own delight. Mr. Carpenter watched her out of sight from the old worn threshold. Wind and flame and sea, he muttered. Nature is always taking us by surprise. This child has what I never had, and would have made any sacrifice to have. But the gods don't allow us to be in their debt. She'll pay for it. She'll have to pay. At sunset, as Emily sat in the lookout room, it was flooded with soft splendor. Outside, in sky and trees, were delicate tintings and aerial sounds. Down in the garden, Daffy was chasing dead leaves along the red walks. The sight of his sleek, striped sides, the grace of his movements gave her pleasure, as did the beautiful, even glossy furrows of the plowed fields beyond the lane, and the first faint white star in the crystal green sky. The wind of the autumn night was blowing trumpets of fairyland on the hills, and over in Lofty John's bush was laughter, like the laughter of fawns. Ilsa and Perry and Teddy were waiting there for her. They had made a tryst for a twilight romp. She would go to them presently, not yet. She was so full of rapture that she must write it out before she went back, from her world of dreams to the world of reality. Once she would have poured it into a letter to her father. She could no longer do that, but on the table before her lay a brand new Jimmy book. She pulled it towards her, took up her pen, and on its first version page she wrote, New Moon, Blair Water, P.E. Island, October 8th. I'm going to write a diary that may be published when I die. The end. And there you go, you guys. We've finally reached the end. I hope you enjoyed this, and I can't wait to start another story with you guys soon. I hope you're having a great week. Like and subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this story at all. And yeah, I'll see you again soon. Bye.